Have you ever created a Word document and then as you look at it, you realize that some of the information doesn't come across as clearly as you would like, and maybe you've used bullets or maybe you've even used tabs, and still it isn't quite the look that you would like to have? Well, you might consider using tables, because tables are a wonderful tool when you want to really get your information across to people in an easy to read format. Well, today we are going to start a two-part series on tables, how to create them, how to format them, and then how to do some fancy things. Well, that'll be in part two. Hi, I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists for Mid-Continent Public Library. And let's get started today by finding that waffle grid and creating a table.
For our first example today, we're going to keep track of some average temperatures. And it might be that you are, say, a gardener or even have a farm, and so knowing the temperatures and keeping track of them is something that you need to do. It may even just be a hobby. If you quilt, you might decide that you want to create a temperature quilt where each square in that quilt represents an average temperature. If you crochet, one of the new popular kinds of blankets that you can crochet is a temperature blanket as well, where each row in that blanket represents the average temperature for a day. You might have someone who needs to do something about temperature and they want to use that information in a science fair. So there are a lot of reasons why you might decide that you want to keep track of average temperatures. So let's go up to just to the right of the Home tab to Insert. And right below Insert, we have the Table button. Now we're going to click on the lower part of that button where we have a drop down. And the very first thing we see here is that waffle grid. And all we need to do is simply select the squares that represent the rows and columns that we want to add. So I just simply drag over, really kind of hover over the first four squares here. They represent four columns. And then as I go down, that represents now two rows as well. And when I get to the lower right of that grid that I want to add into my document, I simply click right on that last square and it puts it into my document. And now all I need to do is fill in the table. So I could type date, for example, and then press tab, and it takes me over to the next cell. So let's see, I could type low and tab, high and tab, and then there's even an average temperature. Now I'm at the end of that row, so how do I get down to the next row? Well, I press tab again. And now I can start putting in some information. So I'll put in a date and tab, a low and tab, high and average. Now again, I have sort of a problem here because I'm at the end of the table that I have outlined, but I want to go down and add another day. How do I do that? Well, I can press tab. Now that I'm in this lower right cell, I can press tab and it automatically adds a new row. So I can continue typing and adding in a new day's worth of information and tabbing in between each one. Now, if I want to add a new row, I would simply press tab again. Now, one of the things that I've noticed here is that my columns are really wide. And one of the ways that I can change the column width or actually even the row height is to look at my ruler. And you can see that you have this kind of little square here that lines up with that column divider line. And all I need to do is put my mouse on top of that square and simply click and drag until I make that column the width that I want it. Well, let me do that again. Now, another way to adjust the column width is to take your mouse, and as I rest it here, you can kind of see that it changes into a pointer that has two parallel lines that are going up and down, and then arrows pointing right and left, showing that's the direction we can drag. So we can simply drag. And again, I can come out to the far right, find that pointer that has the two parallel lines, the arrows pointing left and right, and I can click and drag. Now, as we said earlier, we could also come out to the left, and you can see those little boxes that I could click and drag down, for example, to make that row taller. Or if I want to make the row taller, I can also rest my mouse on that bottom line of the row, and the mouse pointer is very similar to what we saw for columns, except this time the parallel lines are horizontal and the arrows are pointing up and down. And again, that's another way that I could change the cell size. So either with a ruler or with your mouse pointer are two different ways to do the same thing, which is simply resize your rows and columns. Now let's look at a popular way to create tables. And so I've clicked below the one that we've created previously. Let's go back up to the ribbon and to the right of the Home tab to Insert. And then go to the Table button, click the drop down, and we're going to go below the waffle grid to the next choice, which is Insert Table. And when we click Insert Table, we get a dialog box where we sometimes find ourselves counting on our fingers and toes here, but what's the number of columns? Well, we're going to create the exact same table that we've already created. So we would have 4. We can either type that in, or I can use the arrows on the right to increase or decrease that number. I'm just going to type a 4. Now the number of rows, we could leave that at 2 if we want to. Now this is where it's kind of interesting. A lot of times people will just go ahead and take this default of fixed column width, and so it generally will try to make the table fit across the entire page, which lots of times makes your columns a little extra wide, but you can auto fit to the contents. And while we could remember dimensions for new tables, I find that I'm always creating different tables, so I never find this overly helpful, but it all depends on what you're doing and the kind of tables that you create. But I'm going to try this auto fit to contents and click OK. And wow, that is just a little tiny grid, isn't it? But let's put in the same information. So I'll type date, and notice as I type date, that column expands to the right. Well, let's tab, and I'll type low, and then I'll tab high and average. So each one of those columns is the width of the widest entry, which right now is just the column headings. Well, then I can tab down. And again, I'm going to just put in the same information. Actually, I think I'll go ahead and put in a slightly different day. So I'll put in 10-3, where the low is 54 and the high is 78 and the average is 65. One of the things that I might do is want to go back as I am typing. Let's say that that 78 was really a 79 and I've mistyped that information. To go backwards in a word table, instead of using tab, you can use Shift Tab. So as I use Shift Tab, notice that it takes me back a cell, and so then I could make that a 79 instead. Now as I tab, it takes me forward, and if I want to add a new row, again, just like we did before, I simply press tab, and now it takes me down to where I could add new information. Let's see, an 81, and the average for that day was 65. And so it becomes very easy to use that choice, that dialog box as well. I've now moved below our first two tables and we're ready to draw a table. Well, let's go up to the Insert tab on the ribbon, go to Table and the drop down, and then our third choice here is to draw a table. Now with draw a table, you can actually see that your mouse pointer becomes a pencil. And you'll find that you want to draw from the upper left to the lower right for the most part. So I'm going to go across and then down to the lower right. And here's my first cell. And then I can go across and down. And even if I'm off a little bit, when I let up, the cell height is still going to be the same as the previous cells because, well, rows don't have uneven heights and columns don't have uneven widths. So it's going to look at what you've done previously and then try to make everything match. Let's see if I can come down to a second row here and go across and then down. And again, even though I was a little short on that column width, it's going to let me draw some more cells and come up with a second row. This is a little more tedious, but depending on what you need to do, that could be exactly what you need to do. And so now we have our table that we have drawn. Now the fun part is you can actually start at the corner of a cell and go diagonally and create diagonal lines within your table, only with a drawn table though. If I decide to add a third row here, as I click and drag and draw my first cell, you'll notice that even though I had diagonal lines in the second row, it doesn't really try to replicate that in the third row at all. So I can draw my third row here, but not necessarily have the diagonal lines. Now, one thing to point out is that as I created this table, the ribbon changed. And so I can see that in this second group, I have draw table, which is what we are doing, but it also has an eraser. So I can click on eraser. And if I want to, for example, remove those diagonal lines, I can, if I can get a hold of them here, remove the, oh, look at that. I even removed the other line. Well, let's undo. And let's see if we can't grab just the diagonal lines. There we go. Or I could have, in fact, erased one of the other lines, in which case this merges the cells together. So this eraser in the draw group is really a handy tool, and it will show up if you are drawing the table. One other thing I should point out is that anytime you are in a table, if you look at the ribbon and go to the far right, you're going to see that two tabs have been added. These are contextual tabs that only appear when you have a table. The first one is Table Design, which is where we'll spend most of our time, but the other one is Layout, and it's switched to Layout simply because we decided to draw that table. I've moved down the document just a little bit more so that we can create another table. And to do that, we'll go back to Insert and Table, drop down, and then our choice here is Excel Spreadsheet. Well, this will embed an Excel spreadsheet. So let's just take a quick look at how this works. So we'll click Excel Spreadsheet, and it adds an Excel spreadsheet that I could type in, for example. Now, if I decided that I really wanted to work on this Excel spreadsheet, I would need to double click on it because it's embedded, but then watch what happens. Now, if I look at the top, I don't have a Word ribbon. I have an Excel ribbon so that I can do all of my Excel work as a table in Word, and then I simply click out, and then here it is within Word. Now let's look at another way of using tables inserting tables and maybe even copying tables. So to do that, we're going to go back to Insert and Table in the drop down. And this time we're going to go to the last choice here, which is Quick Tables. And as I hover my mouse over Quick Tables, notice that we get a gallery of tables that have been pre-made for us. Now, this looks really exciting, but let's actually kind of go a little farther and select one. So I'm going to click one here. And the thing is, what you select is literally what you get. If you look at the calendars, whatever month that was, that is what you get. So you will find that while you are using this to perhaps copy the formatting, if you have information that you need to, change, then you're going to have to come in and actually make those changes. So, maybe books is something that, yeah, that's correct, and I just need to make a change. But if I need to, say, insert a row or a column, then I'm going to have to do that manually. And so maybe there's an item here. I don't know. Well, we'll just put erasers just for the heck of it. And then I would need to, of course, put that in. If I needed to add a row or a column, I can certainly do that, but this is just the basis for what you want to do. However, let's say that we really want to take this table that has our average temperature information, and we would like to make it available to several other documents. Well, or maybe we just simply want to copy what we've done so far so that if we do this again next year, we could copy it from this year to next year. So to select this table, rather than clicking and dragging over the whole thing, all I need to do is sort of be hovered over this table, or at least clicked in it for sure. And you'll notice that in the upper left, kind of outside the table, but above and to the left, you have a plus sign. When you click that plus sign, it selects the entire table. Now from here, we can go to Insert and the drop down for Table and go to this last choice, which is Quick Tables. And we see the gallery, but below that, here is a button to save the selection to the Quick Tables gallery. So we'll click that. Now we can give this table a name, and we'll call it Average Temps. And then we would save it to the tables gallery for sure. And it seems like general for a category would be fine. You could create a new category. So I suppose you could say personal instead of general. And then you would want to put in some sort of a description. So I suppose we could say current year average temps. And then I'm going to suggest you don't consider changing the building blocks, but you in fact keep it as that. And I would think, because it's a table, you would want to keep it within its own paragraph. So we'll say, okay. Now it doesn't look like we've done anything, but if we go back to Insert Table and the drop down, and we go to Quick Tables, and we scroll all the way down, there we have it. Under General, we now have this starter for the average temperature table, and we can use it year after year after year, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I've moved to a different kind of example here for really our last kind of table that you might want to create. And this happens just every once in a while where you have this great idea of I'm going to type and then I'm going to separate the different kinds of information with a tab. But because of how everything lines up, that tab may not be, well, exactly what you need. So how can you fix that? Well, what you can do is select the text, and I'm just doing a click and drag over the information, and then we're going to go to the Insert tab and Table drop down, and what we can do in the center here is Convert Text to Table. So when we click on that, we do get a dialog box, and it's going to say, well, how many columns do you have? And it probably will pick those up fairly well unless you have some extra commas or tabs. So yes, we have 2 columns, and the number of rows it has picked up just automatically. And then we just need to decide, do we want this a fixed column width? And even though it says automatic, I'm going to click the drop down arrow here just so you can see, or actually I need to go up. So here's 0.3, 0.4, here's a 1/2 inch. So I can determine what that column width is going to be as I click these drop down arrows and up arrows, or I could even type that information in if I'd rather do that. Or I can say I want to auto fit to the contents. Now here is where it's a little bit different from the dialog box where we used to create tables before, and that is, how is the text separated? So what goes in one column and what goes in the next column, how is that separated? And it could be that it is separated by paragraph marks or by commas, or in this case, tabs, but you might even have the occasional pipe, for example, that would be some sort of other document, or even a colon. Might be something else that you would see from time to time, or a dash, or, well, this list is kind of endless. So in that case, you would select other and then type in what that other kind of punctuation is. But we're going to go with tabs because that's indeed what we've used. And then we'll click OK. And yeah, I made it a little too narrow, didn't I? So let's widen those columns out. But look at that. It just, because we now have some borders, our whole table just looks a little bit smarter. It stands out a little bit better. Let's see if I widen that out. That doesn't look too bad either. Maybe I widened this out. Well, that's kind of fun too. So we have all of these possibilities with this table that started out as text, and somehow I just see it visually better on the page than it looked when it was just strictly text. Even though this table looks pretty darn good the way it is, we can make it even fancier if we feel that we need to do that. Now when I click in this table, it will automatically bring up our contextual tab on the right, the table design tab. And from here we can very quickly and easily do some formatting of this table. And the easiest way to do that is come to the Table Styles group, and instead of using the second button, which is just a down button and you just keep clicking and clicking to see each row one at a time, you can come to this third button, the More button, and click on it, and it brings up the entire gallery of choices. And notice that we have different colors. We have different ways of showing grid lines if we prefer those. We can decide if we want really solid color or lighter color. Some of this may have to do with your printers and just how they print out your documents. And notice also that you'll see some differences here. You have what are called banded rows, for example, where you have one that's dark and then you have one that is light, and then they just alternate the background colors of the different rows. You might have an emphasis on the first column or the last column. Generally, you can make those changes even after you've chosen from the gallery by coming to the left. And you can see that we have right now banded rows, we have header rows, where if they don't have a dark color behind them, the text will be bold. First column, if you don't have a really dark color on that first column, then you definitely will have bolded text. If you have last column, if it doesn't make it a dark color, then the text will be dark or bolded. and then we have banded columns. So instead of having banded rows, then you would have banded columns. So every other column would have a slightly darker background. And that's just up to you and what you decide best displays your information. We'll go with something that's fairly simple though as our example. So I'll just click this one. And I'm not so sure I like that one, so let me pick something else here in a different row. Let's try this one instead. I kind of like that one better. Now, because it bolded the column heading, I need to widen my column out a little bit here. And then you'll see that it does, in fact, in that first column, have bolded text compared to the second column. And it doesn't have a lot of the other fancy features simply because, well, it's just two columns. Now, we could also decide to do this kind of fixing our tables so that they are just prettier to look at, not so much with the table styles, but more manually so we have more control over what happens. And so let me undo what I've done here. Get us back to our just very plain grid. And then over at the right, you'll notice that there's a shading button, a border styles button. We can change the borders and the pin colors very manually, or we can come to this borders button, which may look familiar to you, but here we can add bottom, top, left, right borders or no borders. We can add all thin borders, which is what we actually have now. And then we have all of these other different choices. And as I hover my mouse over them, you can kind of see examples of them in the table. But down at the very bottom, we have borders and shading. So now what I would want to do is select the cells that I want to affect and then add the different styles that I want to add. So let me cancel here a second because I think I would like to select just my headers here, my column headers, go back to borders, come down to borders and shading, and then decide, do I want shading? What kind of borders do I want? So instead of a kind of thin line around this border, I think I'd like a thicker line, and I might even want a color. So let me see, I think I'm going to change this to, red, because that'll show up really bright. And for the width, well, I might as well make it kind of bold here. So I think I'll make it 1.5. And then on the right, I get a preview of how that is going to look. And I need to be sure to look at this where it says in the lower right, apply to, and right now I'm just applying it at the cell level because I could apply it to the entire table, and I don't think I want to do that. So again, just the cells. Now, as I look at the top left of this Borders and Shading dialog box, the first tab is Borders, and that's what we've selected, but notice that we could also go to the third tab here, which is Shading, and right now I don't have a color for my shading, but let me select the red, and maybe from there then I can go to more colors and kind of go off of that just a little bit. Maybe we'll come down here to something that's sort of in the same level, and then we'll say, okay. And so now I have this preview, and it's actually kind of obnoxious, but it works. I could even add a pattern to that shading if I want to, but I think that would be way too much. So I'm going to click OK. And now I have applied the border lines and some shading to my column heading, and I've just done it all very manually, but sometimes that's what you want to do. Now I could also come down here and with my borders say, you know, I think I would like my borders to be slightly larger, but I definitely don't want them to be red. I definitely want them to be, say, a dark gray, and I don't want them 1.5 point. I want them, say 3/4. And again, I get this preview of how it's going to look and click OK. And so now I've changed my border lines for the rest of the table as well. But you can either use, again, your table styles or your borders group to change how your table looks. And it might even be that you need to use, say, company colors, and that would be easy enough to do if you use your table design tab. To learn even more, visit mymcpl.org/online learning, where you will find online resources that include Universal Class, LinkedIn Learning, and Learning Express Library. Be sure to join us each week as we present a variety of tech topics. Each week we premiere 3 new videos. You'll be able to find them at 1 o'clock on Wednesday and Friday, or at 2 o'clock on Tuesday. You can find us on Facebook at MCPL 360, or if you prefer, be sure to subscribe to our MCPL MO channel on YouTube, where you'll be able to find our MCPL Consumer Technology Resources playlist.